doing things God's way doesn't always make sense to society. And I think that quote, in a lot of ways, is what's been keeping me from not speaking my truth. I've definitely spoken it. I've definitely come out of the woodwork sometimes and spoken my truth. And there have been times when I have gotten some pushback. And part of that is because the greater society doesn't fully understand what we adoptees experience. And I think my goal and purpose for this podcast is to, first of all, make that known, but second of all, provide adoptees with healing modalities that will actually really help them move the trauma that they held in their bodies pre-verbally out. Welcome, everybody, and it's so great to be together for this first recording of the Resilience Project podcast. And I am beyond excited. This has been at least 2 years in the making. I have wanted to do something like this for some time. And I think I've allowed a lot of things to get in my way. So it is just time to sit down and record, as all of my friends and mentors have told me to do. So here I am. So I'd love to welcome you to the first episode, the introduction episode of the Resilience Project podcast, where adoptees find belonging. And this is going to be a space where I talk all things body. I am going to be really referring to how to integrate our body into our own healing. It is not something that I think is talked about enough, and our body keeps the score. And there's some things that just happened this weekend in my life. I was at a mastermind weekend in La Jolla, California, with honestly, some really great friends who have become close friends in the last couple of years as I have worked with my current business coach, Justin Buonamo. And one of the things that he said at this mastermind was, doing things God's way doesn't always make sense to society. And I think that quote, in a lot of ways, is what's been keeping me from not speaking my truth. I've definitely spoken it. I've definitely come out of the woodwork sometimes and spoken my truth. And there have been times when I have gotten some pushback. And part of that is because the greater society doesn't fully understand what we adoptees experience. And I think my goal and purpose for this podcast is to, first of all, make that known, but second of all, provide adoptees with healing modalities that will actually really help them move the trauma that they held in their bodies pre-verbally out. And so we're going to be getting tips and things like that come from our body as we begin to tune in and listen to, with curiosity, what our body is doing. So I'm really looking forward to that. And another thing that you might learn about me in this podcast, and why I want it to be on video, and you'll notice this quote right here at the back behind me, is, I can't be held responsible for what my face does while you talk. Well, I can't be held responsible for what my face does, period, because my face shows everything. My heart is on my sleeve. You will know that. I may cry. I may laugh. I may be louder than you would want me to be, but I'm going to be real and raw and authentic, because that's just who I am, and that's how I know how to be. So one of the first things I wanted to do was share something that I wrote for Jeff Forney's Innocent People Project. And this is something that I hold near and dear to my heart. And it's really about my story, and it's in a abbreviated version because it could only be 2,200 characters. And some of you may have already heard this, but for those of you who haven't, I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to expand upon my story, because I feel like it will give an understanding as to why I feel the need to actually do this podcast and give a voice to who I believe has been voiceless for a really long time, not just myself, but many adoptees. And so here we go. Here's my story in a very abbreviated version, and then I will expand upon it. I wasn't adopted at birth. Before I was 7 weeks old, I had 4 different caregivers after surviving 2 abortion attempts. I arrived into the world as a disruption, unwanted, unexpected, and already deeply imprinted by chaos I couldn't yet name. So I became the good girl, the chameleon, the one who didn't ask too many questions. But beneath the smile was a little girl wondering, where do I really come from? Why do I feel like such a burden? What parts of me have to disappear in order to be accepted? Years later, reunion cracked everything open. Some answers came, many didn't. But what I found was deeper. A mirror to my pain, a map back to myself, and a grief I could no longer outrun. I learned to perform connection before I ever got to feel it. I carried invisible grief in a body that looked fine from the outside. And I silenced the ache even as it whispered through my nervous system, my relationships, my sense of self. It took years before I realized I was living in fragments, and even longer before I stopped trying to fix what was never broken. My healing hasn't been linear. It's been layered, cellular, and sacred. A return, reckoning, a remembering. I've met the parts of me that once protected me with perfection, people-pleasing, and proving. I've grieved the birth mother I never really knew and can still grieve the versions of me that never got to be. And I've come home to a truth no one could give me. I am mine. I always was. I love the version of me I am becoming and the resilience that has brought me to where I am today. I honestly wouldn't trade the triggers that led to trauma responses because they have taught me so much. Adoption is complicated. But I am not confused anymore about my worth. This is the face of someone who stopped performing and started belonging to herself first. And from that place, I've been able to build a coaching program to help other adoptees do the same. Because being in a community where you are seen, heard, understood, and witnessed is priceless. I share this not because it's tied up in a bow, but because it's real, and real deserves to be witnessed. So to give you a little bit more of this story from what you just heard, when I talk about my adoption experience, I'm talking about, and the trauma that I experienced, I'm talking about those first 7 weeks of my life. There are many adoptees that I have talked to who have experienced trauma outside of that foster care experience, of that life gap, as my friend Lisa Ann from the Wandering Tree podcast calls it. There have been many adoptees who have experienced trauma outside of that first 7 weeks of their life, or their life gap, if you will. When I talk about what has impacted me and what my lived experience is, when I talk about primal trauma, what I am talking about is those experiences that I just referred to. That was before I was even adopted, in the first 7 weeks of my life. And there have been many times that I have heard from people, family even, I don't understand how you could be impacted by something like that. You were so wonderful as a child. And that is definitely true. I was a happy child, but sometimes I can look back at pictures and see things that others can't. I can see the sadness that was behind my eyes. And that's not because I didn't have a wonderful family. I did. And I do. My mom that raised me is one of the most stellar human beings that I know. I wouldn't be who I am without her. I wouldn't have my relationship with God without her. And I am beyond grateful for who she is in my life. We can hear that we should be grateful for the lives that we were given. You were given a gift in this. What needs to be understood is that that gift that gratitude that we're supposed to have, there also was something that we lost. There was also a forced relinquishment or a voluntary relinquishment from a person that we lived in their womb for 9 months. We lived, breathed, grew, shared cells with that person for 9 months and came into the world. And in the 70s, my time, right on the beginning, right after the baby scoop era, which is what it was called because so many babies were adopted before the early 70s. And there were still a lot in the 70s. But in my time, it was right after abortion became legal. And my birth mother, like I mentioned, attempted to abort me between weeks 12 and 16. So I was one of those who experienced an unwantedness within me, a defectiveness. I shouldn't have existed. These are things that I thought I don't want to be an inconvenience. So I would be as perfect as I could be and please as much as I could be. That's what the chameleon reference meant. A lot of us adoptees that I know and have spoken with feel this sense of, I must become something for someone else in order to be accepted. Because for us, we never experienced in those first weeks, the most crucial weeks of our lives, as we are knowing scientifically now, we never experienced the nurture that kept babies experience. Now, there are some kept babies that don't experience nurture. Do not get me wrong. There are babies that incubator babies. There are babies who are preemies. Yes, that happens. And there are also parents of kept children who don't know how to nurture. What I'm saying is, when you go from a place where you only knew that environment, and then you are immediately taken, never given to that environment that you knew, that human that you knew, and that's the only human that you knew, and put into a place, a nursery, where you were taken care of by nurses that you don't know. Now, that does happen, obviously, because that needs to happen, but usually they're immediately brought back to their mother, right? And loved and nurtured and nursed, usually not for closed adoptions. We are taken and we are never given back to the birth mother in the closed adoption experience. Just think about the imprints that are being made in the neurology of an infant brain when they are taken from their mother and given to multiple different hands. There is an unfamiliarity. There is a deeply wounded baby that is experiencing trauma. They are being taken from what they no longer know. They are being taken from all that they knew. That's what I meant. They had been taken from all that they knew. And for me, it was a disruption for her. She did not want me. I was unexpected. It was a one-night stand. She ended up sleeping with 3 different people. She didn't know which one it was, and that's how I came to be. So as she, was kicked out of the house where she was staying for that one night, she leaves and she realizes later, obviously, that she's pregnant, and she has absolutely no idea which one it is, and proceeds to attempt to abort me between weeks 12 and 16. That definitely deeply imprinted me. And I can now see it because I now have knowledge of it, meaning I began to name it. How? After many years in and out of therapy, trying everything, reading every book I knew existed. I didn't even know adoptee books existed. I didn't know people wrote books on adoption. I didn't know about the primal wound. I didn't know about the journey of the adopted self. The primal wound wasn't even written until the 90s, and I was obviously born in 1973. My mom, sadly, she was told, my dad and my mom that raised me were told that they were receiving a blank slate. They were told that. That is what was known in the 70s. That I can't blame them for all that they did at that time because that's what they were told. And sadly, now there are so many of us who are beginning to learn because of the multiple relationships, not just romantic, but friendships that we have either lost or noticed that in order to be okay with who we are, we have to please everybody around us. And our own worth can't come from within because we feel like it has to come from other people. Because quite honestly, when we came into this world, we had no choice. We had to depend on other people. If we would have had boundaries, we would have died. And Heffron talks about that. If we would have had a choice, if we would have been able to say, I don't want to be with you, but we couldn't go back to be with our mother, where would we have gone? We would have died. So in order for us to be okay, we had to allow multiple caregivers in our lives in order for us to survive. So no wonder when I was adopted at 7 weeks old, my mom told me that I stiff-armed her. Anytime she would try to comfort me, I wouldn't allow the nurture. I didn't trust it. What does that say? I didn't feel safe. And that wasn't her fault. That was what was happening in my first 7 weeks of life. 4 different people caring for me. Are you going to stay or are you going to leave? The other interesting thing is maybe the reverse was happening because I ended up sleeping for 24 hours when I got to her house. So I think there was so much going on in my nervous system, trying to settle. I was probably cycling without even knowing it between fight, flight, fawn, freeze, flop, multiple times as an infant. That's crazy. It doesn't surprise me that I had a very difficult time with touch from those that I felt close to, because my concern was if I got close to them, they would leave. It was tied to that original loss, that original rejection, that original secrecy and shame and guilt that I experienced. Like, what was wrong with me that my birth mother decided to give me away? What was wrong with me? The defectiveness of me. The biggest thing that I have seen in those that I have worked with is this deep desire to understand who we are, where we come from, what our culture is, what we've lost. But it happens in layers. It's not something that just appears, that just we immediately understand. For me, it happened when I was getting my master's degree in 2010 in counseling. And one of my professors pulled me aside and said to me, "You are going to need to deal with your adoption because if you don't, you will harm people." She said, "You have skeletons in your closet surrounding this. And I'm just letting you know because as a foster parent myself, I've seen it happen." And of course, at the time, I had no idea what she was talking about. Adoption to me was the most beautiful thing on the planet and still can be. But here's the thing. What I'm talking about right now may not make sense to society. And I really think that this has been placed upon my heart, my soul. I feel like it is my calling to make sure that the world understands that adoption isn't all sunshine and rainbows. Even with the amazing family that I had difficulty in relationships, difficulty feeling like I could be who I really was, that I could be accepted, that I could be authentically me, accepted as I was. There were a lot of negative patterns. Things like self-deprecating talk out loud, calling myself an idiot, calling myself stupid all the time, saying things like, "I can't change, this is just who I am," when, my ex-husband would say things like, I'm here, I'm not going anywhere. And yet I really believed that any relationship I ever had, deep down within me subconsciously, that they weren't going to stay. I had a deep fear even of my children betraying me when they were younger. I remember a friend of mine, dear friend of mine, asking me one time, "You ever get down on the floor and play with your children?" And my response was no. Why would I do that? If I do that, deep down within me, I believed if I got close to them, then they would leave me. I mean, at the time they were only, if I remember right, maybe 15 months and 3 years old when I began to really explore my own personal healing. I was in my early 30s. And what I noticed was I was frozen. I was numb. I could not feel emotion. I didn't know how to name it. It's me how I feel, and I'd be like, happy, sad, I don't know. There was no understanding of what emotion meant, what feeling meant. And I remember, many times growing up, this was what was going on in our era, but it was that whole go to your room until you figure out, how you feel, or well, I can't think of the phrases right now, but I'll give you something to cry about, or go to your room until you can get control of your emotions, something like that. And the thing is, when you're that age, you need somebody that knows how to deal with their emotions. Can't do that by yourself. And because of that, I think there were times that I just felt like my emotions were ridiculous and they weren't allowed. And so I just stuffed them. And because of that, people couldn't get close to me. I kept them at arm's length. And I remember one time a friend of mine said, "Do you ever do anything wrong?" And I was like, "Well, of course I do." She was like, "Well, nobody would know it because you never ever talk about it." Yeah. Y'all, I'm telling you, the trauma that relinquishment impacts, I'm not even saying that right, how relinquishment impacts an infant, it's really difficult to put into words, even for a person who has been trained professionally in it, because it was pre-verbal. And I have spent years trying to figure this out. But what I can say is it deserves to have a voice. The pain deserves to be felt. The pain deserves to be heard and spoken and given a name. Yeah, I think that's what I've got for this episode. And I look forward to talking to you soon about more things that adoptees experience in their lives, um, and provide you with healing and hope from the body perspective, from the fact that the body holds the score. Thanks, y'all, for listening. Peace.